All right, chapter 47. The sun was up. Stanley's heart was still beating. There were 8 lizards in the hole with him. Each one had exactly 11 yellow spots. The warden had dark circles under her eyes from lack of sleep, and a line across her forehead which seemed to be exaggerated in the stark morning light. Her skin looked blotchy. Satan, said Zero. Stanley looked at him, unsure if Zero had spoken or if he had just imagined it. Why don't you go see if you can take the suitcase from Zero, the warden said. You're right, said Mr. Sir. The lizards obviously aren't hungry, said the warden. Then you get the suitcase, said Mr. Sir. They waited. Satin-ly, said Zero. Sometime later, Stanley saw a tarantula crawl across the dirt, not too far from his hole. He had never seen a tarantula before, but there was no doubt what it was. He was momentarily fascinated by it. Its big, hairy body moved slowly and steadily. Look, a tarantula, Mr. Sir said, fascinated. I've never seen one, said the warden, except in... Stanley suddenly felt a sharp sting on the side of his neck. The lizard hadn't bitten him, however. It had merely just pushed off. He leapt off of Stanley's neck, pouncing on the tarantula. The last Stanley saw of it was one hairy leg sticking out of the lizard's mouth. Not hungry, huh? Said Mr. Sir. Stanley tried to return to the snow, but it was harder to get there when the sun's up. As the sun rose, the lizards moved lower into the hole, keeping mainly to the shade. They were no longer on his head and shoulders, but they moved down to his stomach and legs and feet. He could see the lizards on Zero, but believed there were 2 between Zero's knees, shaded from the sun by the suitcase. How you doing? Stanley asked quietly. He didn't whisper, but his voice was dry and raspy. My legs are numb, said Zero. I'm going to try and climb out of the hole, said Stanley. As he tried to pull himself up, just using his arms, he felt a claw dig into his ankle. He gently eased himself back down. Is your last name your first name spelled backwards? Zero asked. Stanley stared at him in amazement. Had he been working on that all night? He heard the sound of approaching cars. Mr. Sir and the warden heard it as well. You think that's them? Said the warden. Well, it ain't the Girl Scouts selling cookies, said Mr. Sir. Sorry, my alarm's going off. They heard the cars come to a stop. The door opened and shut. A little while later, he saw Mr. Pendensky and 2 strangers coming across the lake. One was a tall man in a business suit and a cowboy hat. The other was a short woman holding a briefcase. She had to take 3 steps for every 2 of the man. Stanley Yenitz, she called, moving out ahead of the others. I suggest you don't come any closer, said Mr. Sir. You can't stop me, she snapped, then took a second glance at him, wearing pajama pants and nothing else. We'll get you out of here, Stanley, she said. Don't you worry. She appeared to be Hispanic, with a straight black hair and dark eyes. She spoke a little bit with the Mexican accent, trilling her R's. What in tarnation? The tall man explained as he came behind her. She turned on him. I'm telling you now, if any harm comes to him, we're filing charges not only against Mrs. Walker and Camp Green Lake, but against the whole state of Texas as well. Child abuse, false imprisonment, torture. The man was more than a head taller than she was, and able to look directly over her as he spoke to the warden. How long have they been in there? All night, as you can see by the way we're dressed. They snuck out of my cabin while I was asleep, and stole my suitcase. I chased after them, and they ran in and fell into the lizard's nest. I don't know what they were thinking. That's not true, Stanley said. Stanley, as your attorney, I advise you not to say anything, said the woman, until you and I have a chance to talk in private. Stanley wondered why the warden lied about the suitcase. He wondered who legally it belonged to. And that's one thing he wanted to ask his lawyer, if she really was a lawyer. It's a miracle they're still alive, said the tall man. Yes, it is, the warden agreed. There's just a trace of disappointment in her voice. And they better come out alive, Stanley's lawyer warned. It wouldn't have happened if you'd released him to me yesterday. It wouldn't have happened if he wasn't a thief, said the warden. I told him he would be set free today, and I guess he decided that he'd take some of my valuables with him. He's been delirious for the last week. Why didn't you release him when she came to you yesterday? The tall man said. She didn't have proper authorization, said the warden. I have a court order. That was not authenticated, the warden said. Authenticated? It was signed by the judge who sentenced him. I need authentication from the attorney general, said the warden. How do I know it's legitimate? These boys are in my custody and have proven them danger to society. And am I supposed to just turn them loose any time someone hands me a piece of paper? Yes, the woman said, if it's a court order. Stanley has been hospitalized for the last few days, the warden explained. He's suffering from hallucinations and delirium, ranting and raving. He is in no condition to leave. The fact that he was trying to steal from me on the day before his sentence proves Stanley tried to climb out of his hole, using mostly his arms not to disturb the lizards too much. As he pulled himself upwards, the lizard moved downwards, keeping out of the sun's direct rays. He swung his legs up and over, and the last of the lizards hopped off. Thank goodness, explained the warden. She started towards him, then stopped. A lizard crawled out of his pocket and down his leg. Sam was overcome by a rush of dizziness and almost fell over. He steadied himself and then reached down and took Zero's arm and helped him to his feet. Zero held the suitcase. The lizards, which had been hiding under it, scurried quickly into the hole. Stanley and Zero staggered away. The warden rushed to him. She hugged Zero. Thank goodness you're alive, she said, and she tried to take the suitcase from him. He jerked it free. That belongs to Stanley, he said. Don't cause me any more trouble, the warden warned. You stole it from my cabin, and you've been caught red-handed. If I press charges, Stanley might go back to prison. Now, I'm willing, in the view of circumstances, it's got his name on it, said Zero. Stanley's lawyer pushed past the tall man and took a look. See? Zero showed her. Stanley Yenitz. Stanley looked, too. In big black letters was Stanley Yenitz. The tall man looked over the head of the others at the name of the suitcase. You said he stole it from your cabin? The warden stared in disbelief. It's impossible. It's impossible. She couldn't even say it. Chapter 48. They slowly walked back to the camp. The tall man was the Texas Attorney General, the chief law enforcement officer of the state. Stanley's lawyer was named Mrs. Marengo. Stanley held the suitcase. He was so tired he couldn't even think straight. He held it as he was walking in a dream, not quite able to comprehend what was going on around him. They stopped in front of the camp office. Mr. Sir went inside to get Stanley's belongings. The Attorney General told Mr. Pendensky to get the boys something to eat and drink. The warden seemed as dazed as Stanley. You can't even read, she said to Zero. Zero said nothing. Ms. Marengo put a hand on Stanley's shoulder and told him to hang in there. He would be seeing his parents soon. She was shorter than Stanley, but somehow gave the appearance of being tall. Mr. Pendensky returned with 2 cartons of orange juice and 2 bagels. Stanley drank the juice but didn't feel like eating anything. Wait, the warden explained. I didn't say they stole the suitcase. It's his suitcase, obviously. But he put my things from the cabin in it. That isn't what you said earlier, said Mrs. Marengo. What's in the suitcase? The warden asked Stanley. Tell us what it is, then we'll open and see. Stanley didn't know what to do. Stanley, as your lawyer, I advise you not to open that suitcase, said Mrs. Marengo. He has to open it, said the warden. I have the right to check personal properties and any of the detainees. How do I know there aren't drugs or weapons in there? He stole a car, too. I got witnesses, she said in hysteria. He's no longer under your jurisdiction, said Stanley's lawyer. He's not been officially released, said the warden. Open the suitcase, Stanley. Do not open it, said Stanley's lawyer. Stanley did nothing. Mr. Sir returned from the office with Stanley's backpack and clothes. The Attorney General handed Mrs. Marengo a sheet of paper. You're free to go, he said to Stanley. I know you're anxious to get out of here, so You can just keep the orange suit as a souvenir or burn it, whatever you want. Good luck, Stanley. He reached his hand out to shake, but Mrs. Marengo hurried Stanley away. Come on, Stanley, she said. We've got a lot to talk about. Stanley stopped and took a look at Zero. He couldn't just leave him there. Zero gave him the thumbs up. I can't leave Hector, Stanley said. I suggest we go, his lawyer said in a sense of urgency in her voice. I'll be okay, said Zero. His eyes shifted toward Mr. Pendensky on one side and the warden and Mr. Sir on the other. There's nothing I can do for your friend, said Mrs. Marengo. You were released pursuant of an order from the judge. They'll kill him, said Stanley. Your friend is not in danger, said the Attorney General. There's going to be an investigation into everything that's happened here. For the present, I'm taking charge at the camp. Come on, Stanley, said his lawyer. Your parents are waiting. Stanley stayed where he was. The lawyer sighed. May I have a look at Hector's file, she said. Certainly, the Attorney General said. Ms. Walker, go get Hector's file. She looked at him blankly. Well? The warden turned to Mr. Pendensky. Bring me Hector Zeroni's file. He stared at her. Get it, she ordered. Mr. Pendensky went to the office. He returned a few minutes later and announced the file had been misplaced. The Attorney General was outraged. What kind of camp are you running here, Mrs. Walker? The warden said nothing. She stared at the suitcase. The Attorney General assured Stanley's lawyer that he would get the records. Excuse me while I call my office. He turned back to the warden. I assume the phone works. He walked into the camp office, slamming the door behind him. A little while later, he reappeared and told the warden he wanted to talk to her. She cursed and then went inside. Stanley gave Zero the thumbs up. Caveman, is that you? Caveman, is that you? He turned to see Armpit and Squid walking off in the rec room. Stanley shouted back into the rec room. Caveman, Zero are out here. Soon all the boys from Camp D had gathered around him and Zero. Good to see you, man, Armpit said, shaking his hand. We thought you were buzzard food. Stanley had been released today, said Mr. Pendensky. Way to go, said Magnet, hitting him on the shoulder. And you don't even have to step on a rattlesnake, said Squid. Even Zigzag shook Stanley's hand. Sorry about, you know. It's cool, said Stanley. They had to lift the truck clear of the hole, Zigzag told him. It took everybody in C, D, and E. We just picked it right up. It's really cool, said Twitch. X-Ray was the only one who hadn't come over. Stanley saw him hang back for a moment and then returned to the rec room. Guess what, said Magnet, staring at Mr. Pendensky. Mom says we don't have to dig holes anymore. That's great, said Stanley. Will you do me a favor, said Squid. I guess, Stanley agreed, somewhat hesitantly. I want you to... He turned to Mrs. Marengo. Hey, lady, do you have a pen and paper I can borrow? She gave it to him. Squid wrote down a phone number in which he gave to Stanley. Call my mom for me, okay? Tell her I'm sorry. Tell her Alan said he's sorry. Stanley promised he would. Now, you be careful in the real world, said Armpit. Not everybody's as nice as us. Stanley smiled. The boys departed. When the warden came out of the office, the Attorney General was right behind her. My office has been having some difficulty locating Hector Zeroni's records, the Attorney General said. So you have no claim of authority over him, said Mrs. Marengo. I didn't say that. He's in the computer. We just can't access his records. It's like it's fallen into a hole of cyberspace. All cyberspace, Mrs. Marengo repeated. How interesting. When's the release date? I don't know. How long has he been here? Like I said, we can't. So what are you planning on doing with him? Keeping him confined indefinitely without jurisdiction while you're going crawling through holes of cyberspace? The Attorney General stared at her. He was obviously incarcerated for a reason. Oh, and what reason is that? The Attorney General said nothing. Stanley's lawyer took Zero's hand. Come on, Hector. You're coming with us.